Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome
Hello.
to the Late Action Gateway again. We've got Helen Camisa here, and I'm very excited to have her be here with us today. And hope you guys are all doing well. So we're just going to hang out for a few seconds. If you want to say hello in the chat, we'd love to say hello to you. And otherwise, yeah, we'll just kind of do what we were doing before, which is shoot the breeze. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can ask like people something to share in the group chat. We usually say where you're from, but maybe what's another question we can ask? How they're doing today, what they're feeling with the energy today, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So either what they're feeling with the energy today, do you have any questions for them, Helen? Or where they're feeling the most energy in their body today, where the energy's building?
I want to know what's giving you pleasure today, if
I
anything.
love that. That's
a
awesome.
great question. Yeah, lovely. What's giving you pleasure today?
I'll start.
Yeah, go
Or
for it.
For me, it's my matcha tea. I deviated from my regular one because I ran out, and on this island, I'm on Gabriel Island, and they only have so much variety here. So I had to, this is very privileged, but I had to get this other kind, and it was like not even close. And I finally got the kind I like, and it was just like the best to have that. And yeah, it's like, and it's, I don't know, it's a silly thing, but to me, it makes the biggest difference.
Yes.
How about you, Keith?
Yeah, I was going to go with something food related too. I was going to say the smoothie I made this morning. And just getting greens out of the garden and putting them in the smoothie brought me a lot of joy and pleasure.
Straight from the garden.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Helen?
I mean, I've done both those things today as well, the tea and the smoothie, and they're really good. But I also wrote a birthday card for my friend, and anyone that knows me knows that I'm totally a snail mail champion. I love letters and cards. And so, yeah, anytime I get to send somebody like old-timey mail, pleasurable. Feels very nice.
Totally. I love that snail mail champion. It's a good.
It's on my Instagram. It just says champion of snail mail. I love it.
Great. I love that.
Andrea says we can't hear Helen or Keith. Is that still true, Andrea? That's weird. Can everyone else hear us? Are we here?
I think, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it could be something with your machine. I'm not sure, Andrea. That's bizarre.
Yeah.
And now she'll never know because she can't hear you. So
maybe I should say that, Andrea. I think it's something with your machine. And Lori says she's enjoying the sunshine. Miriam says berries are giving me pleasure today. Amanda says walking on the flats here in Vancouver with a light shower of rain on my face and waves crashing at my feet. That's so poetic and beautiful.
That sounds poetic. Yeah.
Yes.
Bob says, hello, the cooler weather gives me better energy. Yeah, especially after the heat waves, I find.
Right on. So I think we're going to get started here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to have all of you here and see where this conversation goes. And I think many of you know the format now, that Katie's going to pop back in if there's any burning questions, and we're going to chat for 45 minutes or 50 minutes or wherever we go. And then we'll come back on at the end for questions. So bye, Katie.
Bye.
There she goes. Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much, Helen, for being here. I'm so excited to have you on the Late Action Gateway. You're a beautiful human, and I love you dearly. And I'm so excited for this conversation. With that, I mean, people know a little bit about me. Maybe they're not so familiar with you. So would you be willing to say a few things about how you got into what you're doing now and what it is you're up to in life?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am a yoga teacher here in Vancouver and also a comedian. And I've been doing like performing comedy for many, many years on and off. And yoga is kind of newer. And by newer, I mean like 10 years. So it's been a little while now. And honestly, I got into this work from, trying yoga because I was having a hard time in my life and in my body, but in my body, I didn't care. I was just like, I'm going to get taller and thinner. It's going to be great. And so I started doing yoga. You can't get taller, by the way. But I started doing yoga to just help me feel better and to get stronger and more flexible. And then when I became a regular practitioner, I started to discover that the really negative nonsense voices in my head were just not as loud and not as consistent, and I didn't understand why. I just knew that had never happened for me before. Regardless of where my body was or what I looked like or how I was feeling, those voices were very consistent and annoying. And so I just pursued the practice more for that, and then I eventually ended up working at a yoga studio and took a teacher training, like long story short, and then became a yoga teacher. But even within that, I was like, well, that's not, I don't really look like a yoga teacher, quote unquote, look like. So I still kind of felt like I needed to change some things. And then, you live and you learn and you realize that's not the case. And so, yeah, I've been teaching yoga now for a number of years. And I specifically turned my focus to teaching people in bigger bodies. I teach a series called Full Bodied Yoga, and anyone, can take it, but it's really targeted at people working in bigger bodies like myself to show you that you can be in your practice and you can be in your body. And I invite you to find joy in your body and pleasure through yoga. So it's just a part of a bigger picture. And I use a lot of humor. I think that's for some people or not, but it's my style. So I use it in my classes. And I share them live on Zoom, and I teach some classes online. And then I do, in terms of comedy, I perform improv about town. And that is another really important piece of my life. And so I've become really lucky over the last few years that I've managed to work to a place where this is what I do with my time. And I feel very, very appreciative of that. And I get to spend my time helping people and also helping myself, because when we're practicing these things and I continue to learn and, work with you, Keith, and like when I continue to research and learn, it helps me and supports me on my own journey and my own path. And then at the same time, hopefully get to offer that out. And for anyone who's not into yoga, you can watch me do comedy from time to time, and hopefully that brings you some ease and some pleasure as well. That's a little ramble about me.
Yay, thank you.
Yay.
It was a wonderful ramble. So yeah, just as you were talking about, improv, I guess one of the questions that just popped into mind is, how do you bring improv or that mindset into your yoga teaching? Or do you find that it's hard to be that spontaneous with a class of people? Or, like where's the nexus, the intersection between that spontaneity that you crave, that really in the moment sense, and how it then flows into a yoga practice or being in the body? Because I guess that's about being in the moment too, and feeling the moment that we're in. So how do you like bring it into your teaching? I have to admit, I haven't taken a course yet or a class, which is sad. I need to solve that.
It's
to fix
okay.
that.
I think it's, it's not the same as, it is. Yoga has its performative element because you're there to present in a certain way for people to feel supported. But it's certainly not. I think when I started teaching, a few of my friends who don't really do yoga were like, I can't wait to come. It'll be like a comedy hour. And it's just not that. I'm not there like making jokes. We are there to practice, but it does really help because I think it really takes away. I feel like some teachers get really stuck in this idea of we need to seem perfect in a way, or our practice seems to need perfect to be able to share it. And that's just not the case. I've found the more human you are, the more people can relate, and then they feel less of a need to be a certain way. But it does help when I'm in a class and if I mess something up, which inevitably happens, or you miss a thing, or once when I was newer, because I love tea. We were talking about tea earlier. I kicked over my tea and then subsequently slipped in it while I was teaching. And I think it would have been a very different moment if I didn't have a sense of humor and a quick wit. And so we just laughed it off. And then the other side of it, that's not necessarily humor specific, but improvising, which doesn't mean to be humorous necessarily, is when I'm teaching, I usually have a class plan and often a theme in mind. But when I say hello to everybody at the top of the class, and usually there's time for a little, how are you, a little chat. If I feel, and I think this comes with time in teaching because it wasn't this way when I was new, but if I feel that there's something else required, then I'm able to pivot and change the plan so that I feel that I'm best serving my students. So it's really helpful that way, for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so in when we were dreaming up today's topic, we came to this idea of humor and grief and embodied practices to invite the light in, or more light in. And can you share anything from your personal journey where you see humor and grief kind of working together in your life, or what kind of brought that? I mean, because you've had experiences with grief, and as we all have, and like, where's the relationship you see between humor and grief, and how do they interweave in your life, and how did they kind of become themes for you? I would say, I mean, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I feel like they're very important themes for life, and I feel like you kind of carry that wisdom in you.
Thank you. You can put words in my mouth. You make me sound great. No, I think humor and grief are two sides of the same coin. I think it's very. I feel like they balance on an edge of each other. In the times of my life where I've experienced the most grief, there's definitely been bursts of humor, which I think some people would find entirely inappropriate. And one of those times, my brother and I have two brothers, two wonderful brothers, but my brother and I still chuckle about it. Unfortunately, our mother passed away very suddenly, but at her funeral, something happened, and we had to pretend like we were crying because we were laughing so hard. Like they're not, I don't think they're one or the other. I think you're not always in one. I think sometimes we have this idea that we're supposed to sit in one, and then it's not respectful to bring in that other, but I think it can really help. And I think our body also just needs those bursts of feeling regardless of what they are. And I think just being able to find or lean on humor, even if it's not necessarily in you, if you're like, oh, Helen, I would not be laughing at a funeral, like just to find humor, or to whatever is humorous to you, and to draw it close when you are struggling. And that's not to say that grief doesn't need its time. We have to honor it and be with it. But I think it's made easier when you're able to inject it with humor. And it's a very fine line, because I'm not saying that we want to mock things that are important and have gravity, but I think that using humor, for me anyway, has helped me through some of the darkest times of my life. And if I didn't have it, I don't really know. I don't know where I'd be, or I don't know how quickly I would have bounced back. And bounce back is a strong word. There's some things you just claw back slowly, but having that humor, and the world is like, life, in my opinion, is kind of hilarious. Like the world is so, we don't really have control. We try so hard. I've tried so hard, but life is very random, and there's a lot of joy in it, and there's a lot of sadness. But I also think like sometimes I do feel like life is a bit of a cosmic joke, and we're all kind of there. And so why not try to find joy and humor where you can? If it's helpful. For me, it's helpful.
So in traditional Chinese medicine, you can have a condition where the fire element becomes unbalanced, and there's a Shen disturbance, and someone goes into like a manic state where they might laugh inappropriately for a while at a bunch of stuff, which is like a clearance, and maybe, moving more towards the funeral scenario. But there's many different ways that can evolve, obviously. But like, what about like, how has like your practice of embodiment through yoga, like the more people get in their body, the more deep the humor that they speak from. They speak to that cosmic conundrum kind of humor, and it's less kind of manic blow off steam kind of humor. I don't know if you've noticed that or if you feel that. So that do you have anything to say on that? Because I have other questions.
I think my humor, I think my humor in some ways is still self-deprecating, but it's different level. And so before I had gotten into the world of like wellness and self-care and taken my own path with that, a lot of my jokes were, I hope, I'm sure I've offended people in my life, but I never appreciate humor that's like at people, but I definitely didn't mind taking shots at myself all day, every day. And sometimes when you sit with that, you realize, I'm not being very nice to myself. And that's not humor. It's not joyful. It's just me being like a little quick. And so I think I've, over time, like getting into my body more, shifting those layers of grief, exploring, pain that I hadn't either wanted to or been ready to explore, letting that come through me and continue to, right? It's never done, unfortunately, has allowed me to like feel deeper kind of, I guess, joy or deeper appreciation. And I don't even know if humor is the word, but definitely joy and pleasure, and to laugh. There's a difference between, like I say, laughing in a sort of self-deprecating or the world is garbage versus true laughter for things that are pleasurable or funny or joyful in your life. And I think, I've always been a humorous person. That's always been there for me. So it's not that it wasn't there before, but it definitely is. Yeah, I think it's different when you get into your body more, and if you are someone who is hard on yourself, when you can start to let that stuff go. There's much more interesting things to be curious about, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, actually. So there's this evolution you find with even the way you relate to humor, and the more, it's almost like the more grief you sit with, or the more pain you can be with, the more expansive your range in comedy. Is that true?
I think yes, and I think also you become, or I've become, I can't speak for all of you, just more empowered. And so even just specific to comedy, I work mostly now with femme groups. Not that I don't love performing with men as well, but historically, when I used to do it, women tend to be outnumbered. And so the humor is often about women, or it's sort of patriarchal humor that I just used to go along with, because I'm like, well, that's just what we're laughing about. That's what everybody thinks is funny. And even when I started writing comedy, a teacher once pointed out to me, and it was a male teacher, but he was like, your joke here is aimed, even though what I was trying to say was something else, he's like, you're aiming it at women. And I was like, wait a minute. And so once I started to do that, internal work and become empowered as a person and human and as a woman, and see some of the nonsense I'd been putting up with for decades, it takes a different angle. It feels like that again. It's not that it was all self-deprecating, but it's on the same note. I just realized my stuff now is more. Some of it's just silly. I don't want to say it's all super empowered. I have done a fart joke here and there. I'm not all class. But it's definitely more, it comes from a more either just silly, joyful place, or definitely from an empowered place where I want to make a point. Like I recently wrote, and we haven't filmed anything yet, but I recently wrote a sketch about going to the doctors as a big person and how they disregard you. And it was really interesting to write that. I wouldn't have been able to do it a number of years ago because I would always leave there in shame. And now because I'm like, how dare you get better at your job, please. So it was very interesting to sit and be like, how do I hit this point that's really been a key thing in my life, but how do I also make it humorous for people? How do I make it as silly as it really is, but it is also very personal for people who experience it? It's not, does that make sense? Like it's not funny when it happens, but it is absurd. And so we can take that. But historically, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I wouldn't have felt comfortable.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing that one. I checked out a few of your sketches. The Good Not Great comedy, right, is where you're at.
Good Not Great, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really good. They are funny and they are silly. You do bring in the silly, and that's silly. I think important. Okay, well, I guess you've alluded to it. My first discussion with an interview format was with Bruce Sanguin, and we were talking about trauma. And I'm wondering if you can kind of tie that in at all, like in terms of your own experiences growing up, anything that kind of shaped you, and more speak to like how that difficulty has given you these gifts that you now share with the world, and kind of that whole angle that, what did Gabor Mate say recently about trauma? What did he call his thing? Oh, I can't remember. Did you watch that?
I did not.
Okay. Anyways.
Sorry, Gabor.
Yeah, it's okay. You're not a true Vancouver resident if you have that. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, so like how is kind of trauma or overcoming difficulty in your own life, challenges, shaped the way you relate to what you do now, through humor and practice?
I think when I was younger, like when I was a kid and teen, it was more feels like the obvious thing, but again, I'm not a small person, and so that, because I think because I wasn't quote unquote like pleasing in that way to people when I was younger, I really did then lean on other things and like performance, and that's where I really found my love for performing. But my family has always, I'm from the UK originally, and if anyone is from the UK or knows people, like humor is such a big part, like sort of caustic humor, and so that's how we show affection, and that, at least in my family, that's how we show affection. And so I really grew up with like a lot of jokes, a lot of joking around the dinner table, a lot of teasing each other. Like if you buy someone a birthday card that's got a nice poem, people are like, what is wrong with you? Are you well? So it's always like, has to be jokes, has to be kidding around. And so I really grew up in that, which I think is really wonderful. I really appreciate it. And then, but it also has that flip side of like, when it was finally time to like look at my other emotions, I was like, oh dear, now I have to look at these. So that was just already a part of me. And then I think I leaned on it a lot when I got older and felt like I just didn't fit, or I wasn't, and I was, I had the humor, but I was very unhappy in my body for such a long time. And that really dictated so much of my life and my mental space. And then I think as an adult, my main like key point of like shift or trauma or grief was my mom passing away, and I really got afraid, and I was very afraid for a long time. But I also think I kind of was like, I don't want to be on this conveyor belt that is life that we've kind of set up. I want to start looking outside of it. And I always had that in me, sort of a like yearning to do other things or to break from the pack. But also when you're physically not happy with how you look, you want to blend. You want to blend. You don't want people looking at you and making fun of you. So you're like, so it's that thing of like, how do I blend, but also break out? You can't is the answer. And so I think after my mom passed away and I realized like nothing to me felt safe. I wanted that safety, but I also kind of was like, in a way, I don't care. Like I want to shape things the way I want. And it took me a really long time because I was very fearful for those first few years. But I don't, not that, it's hard because I would wish that to not have happened if I could, but I can't. So I suppose like the gift in a way that has come, or one of them, if you can look at it that way, is that I like my life is what it is now. And I feel like it's on a trajectory that I feel good about, is because I kind of let go of wanting to please and wanting to be what other people want me to be. And it's only recently, I would say, even with all that work, I didn't know what it was leading to. But I feel like it's only recently, and I would say the last year, that I've been like, who am I and what do I want? And it feels like such a basic thing, but I think a lot of us don't ask it because you just go along. You're supposed to be this, you're supposed to look like this, you're supposed to do this, and so I'm now in this place and I feel lucky that I get to do it, but I have more time because I've shaped my life in that way where I get to sit and go, who am I and what do I want? And I don't fully have the answer, but I'm okay with that, mostly okay. But I feel privileged to be able to ask the question. And I hope that when the answer comes, I'll be brave enough to follow it, but it's not easy. And humor helps with fear. I think you know me for a long time now. Fear definitely runs around in my mind, and humor really can help you break out of that with like laughter, and can help shake you out of that frozen state. But I won't pretend it's all been like laughter all the way. It's very hard. But does that answer? It was a ramble.
Yeah, no, that totally does, and it makes me think of like the freeze response, and how powerful that is in terms of its effect on grief. Like, when there's a lot of fear in the system, grief, I feel, becomes much more sticky, right? And our ability to then move through it, it's harder. So in fact, like having fear and grief happen at the same time, which happens for many people, like and experiencing our way through that, and then out to the more rarefied air of like, who am I? Like, I think that's a really key question to be asking these days. And it is perhaps a privileged question, but at the same time, it's such a key question, and that I wish, like I think that the more we exit out of that survival response as a species, the more compassion we can build for the human journey. And if it is about building that compassion, finding the nexus point between grief and praise of life, like maybe there's maybe this is a direction that we all need to become more aware of. And so all of that leads me to a question about embodiment of grief, actually. So for me, like we typically think of grief as like this action, like a collapsing of the lungs, and kind of like, there's probably famous paintings that I'm forgetting their names of, but like that that picture of like a grieving person just collapsing. And so I wonder, like, that's a form of grief. It's stuck grief. But the kind of grief that we're moving towards, or we're hinting at, is like how to emerge from that stuckness. And so how does that look in your practice? Do you ever speak to that directly in yoga, about how to open the lungs or open the channels for grieving and then make more space? And does that then help with the emotion, the emoting part?
That's a good question. I think sometimes I just trick my students with the physical practice, because there are physical shapes you can make as soon as they can feel quite vulnerable, always with, the caveat that you can do or not do whatever you want. There's no like, you must do this to feel that. No. Like the physical practice, like my key sort of thing when I teach is people's autonomy. I want them to do what they want to do. But I've definitely done a lot. I love teaching heart opening practices, which are back bending practices, really, so that we get into this area, and then usually adding an intention to that. And I do find, that compassion is such a key one for ourselves and for others, because as soon as we start to treat ourselves with compassion, walls kind of come down, and compassion rather than judgment, and it gives space to feel your feeling. And it's not even necessarily feel your feelings, because they're sitting in the body. I've definitely had students come up and be like, I don't know what's happened here. I just cried my face out, and we were just doing a forward fold, So I do talk about the, emotions being a very natural side effect of the practice for some people, not for all. But yeah, I don't know if I've ever touched on, because I feel like grief is even in my own world, still such an interesting topic. And I've definitely gone to classes that sort of touch on that. But it's more, I just want people to get into their bodies in a way that invites them to release, if that's there for them. And I think for me, for what I teach and the way that I teach, it usually has more to do with your relationship to your body. And I think people have a lot of grief around that, or the way that they are treating themselves or have treated themselves. And so my hope is that we can shed layers in that way. But I think it's it's challenging, because it's very vulnerable for people. And I really respect that. And I really respect that, especially these days, I'm not in the room with them. We're on Zoom. So I just try to put people in a space where I'm not trying to elicit anything, but I want them hopefully to come to a place where they're either open enough or relaxed enough that they can tap into whatever might be going on in their life or in their body, more importantly, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about vulnerability. I feel like there's a really, in my own life, like a connection between vulnerability and humility, and then the ability to release the idea of a perfect, or this constrained idea of anything and that fixation that happens in the spine and in the body around contraction of energy. And so healing, to me at least, is becoming more and more about this idea of expansion. How do we expand the energy? How do we breathe into the space and feel and expand the energy? And that often means that we come up against these fixated energy blockages in the body, where there's stored emotion and stored memory and all of these things. So, I think, the embodied practice that you offer is such a beautiful way in, and just the gentleness which you shared that piece about vulnerability. I can imagine your students feeling extraordinarily safe. So, I guess maybe the experience you had with fear, and your mom's passing, like, allows you to have a tremendous sensitivity to other people's safety. And that probably comes through just by who you are, the way you carry it. And I bet that a lot of the magic that happens for you in your career, like building this amazing following you have, is because of that safety that you create for vulnerability and therefore expansion and healing through all of these things. Does that kind of ring true for you?
It does. And I love the term like expansion too. Like some of the poses I teach, they're physically expansive. And then I think when we're feeling less, if that slowly brings us out of that fear, icy state, then we can do, poses that are more, I even do poses that are essentially like power posing in my classes, where we're just like, so we're taking up our space, we're expanding through space. And I think even outside of, yoga, for like whatever people need to do to help them, like you say, grief doesn't have to look, it can, and it has, right, look like this. And, last fall, I went to Fino, and it was my mom's birthday at the time. And usually I haven't yet found any rituals that feel right for me to do. And so she loved going places. And so we went, but on her birthday, it was late October, like I just put on a wetsuit and ran into the ocean. And it was I was grieving, I was sad, but I was like, it was a very expansive gesture. And I just remember being like, I'm sure I didn't have a surfboard. People were on surfboards, and I was just like, yeah, like into the waves. And I think like that was still a gesture of like all of my feelings, but it's obviously very different than like hunkering in on the couch. And neither is wrong, but it did feel very nice. And I will say it felt more like I think after having so much fear around all of it, it does feel nice to find these ways to express it in an expansive way, and in a way that that was like literally charging into the water, but I do like that energy of charging towards life a little more. I think I needed a little bit of fire in my life to help me along. And so, yeah, I think when people feel ready, it can be really nice to find those expansive ways to express and to feel, whether it's in a yoga practice or just like safely running into the sea, if that's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm. So that's an example of grief becoming expansive on a very individual level through something that you did. What about like this idea of grief living or stuck grief living really in isolation or solitude, which everyone's experienced quite a bit of in the last year, and how do we then bring back that ritual element of community, or how have you? You kind of said you haven't spoken too much to it in your group activities, but is there a way to bring that into a group setting that's more ritualized or makes more space for it to happen through intention? And does that allow it to move more because it's then a shared energy field versus like having to do it through, expanding into the ocean, which is wonderful. It's beautiful practice. And I always think of the water with emotion, and particularly with tears. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been taking classes recently with a local teacher here named Teresa Campbell, who's amazing, and she does a lot of grief work. She does a lot of Kundalini yoga, and in a lot of her classes we shake a lot, which I find really great. We're just like shaking your whole body, and I've been teaching it a little bit. I teach Hatha yoga, but I don't care. Like partway through the class, after a pose or something that might feel confronting, we just shake and flutter our lips. And I think even when you're separated by screens, that you can still invite a sense of like community to remind each other that we're not alone and that we're here. And I think then going back into the world, I've gone to before any of this COVID business. I used to go to like trance dances, which if you told me X amount of years ago, I would have been like, get out of here. There's no way. But go to these things and just like dance around a room with people you don't know. But it does create this really nice sort of, yeah, collective energy. And I'm an introvert, so I have to admit I'm very cautiously stepping back into the world. Um, it's a bit anxiety inducing for me, but I was mentioning to you earlier, like I've been going to the pool. And what I'm noticing too, especially in the city here, people usually vary. I feel people are a little more like smiling at each other and acknowledging, because we haven't been able to do that. So I think, if people are trying to reintroduce into the world, and if you're like me, you're not quite ready to go on a big group hang for whatever reason, it might just be that acknowledging people in the world. And it started with me just to go out in nature more and acknowledging the nature around me before I was acknowledging people. But that still was like an integration, because I definitely went through a phase where I really didn't want to leave the house very much, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. So going back and like getting into nature, acknowledging that, and now I'm sort of acknowledging people, and I feel like that's just taking those slow steps and honoring that it I feel like it's like a wave, right? You kind of go out. For me, I go out and then I have to come back. And I only learned that about myself not a few years ago. I really, because I'm a jokester and I just thought, oh, I'm an extrovert that's having a hard time. And then I realized, oh, I'm not. I'm an introvert. I like to be at home and I need space. When I've seen a person, even a person, a friend, that's it for the day usually. And I used to be like, that's ridiculous, Helen. Get going. You like your friends, go out. And I've just learned that that's what I need. And it's much easier to respect that. And so, same with this, I go out and then I come back. And then I go out and then I come back. So I think it's different for everybody. But yeah, if people are trying to get back into community, I know maybe it sounds weird, but I really do think nature is a great place. It doesn't even have to be people. Just like nature, getting it, because we're part of that. That is a part of our community. It's not just other humans. We're part of this bigger community of this planet. So, nature, water, trees, sand, whatever you want. And then once we start to feel more a part of this thing, then we can maybe expand. And then I know other people that were like, as soon as things loosened, they were like, hi, and they were out. And I think that's lovely. It's just not me. It's definitely not me.
Well, the relationship with nature may sound strange on some formats, but it's definitely, doesn't sound strange here at all.
Yes, I was gonna say.
And I do feel like, everything you said there, like our relationship with Mother Nature, I mean, and our particularly, gratitude for Mother Nature and praise of Mother Nature. It is a relationship that many people have lost, that feeling of connection, that feeling of always having the earth as support under our feet, as a nourisher. And it is hopefully something that more and more people are rekindling a connection with, because of isolation, because of going back to basics, whatever you want to call it. And because the realization that the simple pleasures in life are really, the enduring ones, the ones that for me at least, create the most lasting joy or pleasure. So before we got on just as we were getting on the call, you asked everyone what was bringing them pleasure today. So how do you feel like pleasure in your own life relates to joy and humor, and potentially even, like, is there pleasure in grief, or are those two siloed?
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that. I do, feel like, I don't know. I really have just been asking myself what's pleasurable for me more. In terms of like tying that in with just humor, like laughing personally and giving people laughter is one of my greatest pleasures in life. If I get to laugh every day, which I mostly do, I feel so grateful for that. And like one of those good ones, where you're like little tears. And yeah, I really, really, that gives me so much pleasure. And I think sort of allowing yourself that. I think we live in a society that pleasure has been kind of like, it's like something you're supposed to have in small doses, and then you get back to the other, especially if living, in a world of like diet culture specifically. I used to have such a difficult relationship with food because of that, because I love food. I always have. My dad's side of the family, the lineage is Italian, and my grandmother was from Italy, so she cooked. And just that feeling of, even when Katie was talking about her tea earlier, and her body was like, oh, yeah. Sometimes when I cook, I'll taste something and be like, oh God, and I'm not a great cook. But for a long time, all that around that for me was like measuring, and it was packaged stuff that I could count, and there was no pleasure in it, and the pleasure piece was made to feel like it was a bad thing or a guilty thing. And I feel like, without realizing it, that transferred out into other pieces of my life, where it was like, you need to control yourself here, you need to control yourself by exercising excessively, and pleasure is going to lead you off the road. So it's been really nice to initially to come back to my relationship with food, which took a number of years. It was not a small feat. And then I think through that, I've started to be like, oh, I love this, right? If we're all today, like, I get to do this thing and I feel this is so pleasure, whatever it is for you, reading a good book, going by the sea. Someone was talking about the rain on their face. I'm with you. Like, so I've really become like, what are we here for? And I want to offer things and give things and all of that. That's really important to me. But I also feel like we're not here for a long time necessarily. I want to be greedy for pleasure as much as I can. And I don't know, it's hard for me to think of pleasure in grief. But that being said, I think grief comes in many forms and in relation to a lot of things. And a lot of times we grieve a chapter closing because we're moving on to something better or something else or something we want. And so I think there is that. I've bawled my eyes out many times when I've left a place or left people or transitioned, not necessarily jobs, but some jobs, moved cities when I moved away from my family. But it's been in the name of like moving on to something that I really wanted. And so there was pleasure there. And then the grief was a part of it. So I think they do in some ways go hand in hand. I guess if I'm thinking of it on the nose, I just don't feel like when I'm grieving, I'm not like, this is great. It's a good time, right? I don't feel, but I think that's too simplistic. I think when, I think allowing ourselves that grief makes space for the other. And, I still find that so challenging, grief and change. I'm a very comfort oriented person. But I think that it's like to make friends a little bit with grief has been helpful for me and allowed me to not be so afraid of it. And because in order for anything to change, we have to get uncomfortable and familiar with chapters closing. And so I think it can be sort of not wrapped in pleasure, but they're, in a way, I suppose they're linked. It's a good question. I've never thought of it.
Like two sides of the same coin, potentially. And like you said, the many faces of grief, like some kinds of grief, like I've been in, and maybe this is not grief potentially, but I've been, experiencing intense gratitude for my life on some moments, and then just had so much heart opening that I start crying and remembering something that I loved or that I cared about, or that it's being taken, in this last year for me, it's been a lot of grief about my mother and her life, and also the journey through Alzheimer's. And that, even as hard as it is to watch that process, it brings back all the memories of gratitude for the spirit she is, and who she came here and what she shared with me and others.
Well, and there is not one without the other, right? If we don't love something, if we haven't had such a deep feeling of love or joy or pleasure, then we don't grieve it.
Yeah.
because we didn't feel that in the first place. And
Yes.
I was listening to a podcast yesterday called Table Manners, and it's a mom and daughter, and they cook for their guests, and they ask them what their favorite dessert. And one of the things that came to my head right away was rice pudding, because my great grandmother, who I was lucky enough to know, used to make it. But as I was in the kitchen making something while I was listening to it, and I was like, rice pudding, and then almost immediately I was like, oh, right? It's just like both feelings were equally true, but it's so interesting how, like you say, it elicits, but it's because I loved her so much. You feel like, oh God, right? So yeah, there, without one, there isn't the other, I think.
Right. And I guess the more expansive our heart space gets, the more open we become to including all of life and all of the feelings, the more that that one easily turns into the other. Like there's almost like a seamless transition between the two, like you just
and it's
described.
worth it. It's not easy though. And for a long time, I used to pride, which is funny. It'll be funny to you because you've only known me in these stages of my life of like opening and grief. But I used to pride myself on, like, people were like, oh, I've never seen you cry. Now people are like, oh, it must be another day. Helen's having a cry. So I just used to be like, no, man, I don't have any feelings. It's cool. But when you do that, yes, you're protected, but you really close yourself off to the other deeper things. So it's a very, like, I understand it. And if anyone's feeling that way watching this, I get it, because I've done it. But yeah, when you can kind of open yourself up to that, you're also opening yourself up to like greater joys in life. You can't have one without the other. It's so annoying. If I could, I would be so down for never feeling bad or having grief, but that's just not the name of the game. So yeah.
Right on. So you've definitely mentioned a couple like back bending exercises and power stances of taking up space. Like and you've mentioned nature. So what are some other poses or in ways to breathe that you've found most helpful when you know there's something stuck and you don't know how to access it?
Yeah. I really do like and teach often and recommend. There's a pose called reclined butterfly, and the legs are optional. That's actually the butterfly part, but you essentially lie back, soles of the feet together, knees wide, and I put a big bolster, which is like a big yoga cushion, or you can roll up a blanket, or if you have a big cushion, and you recline onto it, like your head is on it. But when you do that, because a bolster is like long, you're essentially, your spine is supported, and then you're kind of hanging off, so your heart lifts. It's nice because it's supported and held, and you can add a blanket for like comfort if you're feeling a lot and you want a little support. But it just offers you to sit in that heart space. I actually recommended to a friend recently who was like having grief about a loss, and she was like, I can't feel it, I don't know. And so I was like, try that pose, I really don't know. And she messaged me and was like, that was a good tip. She just like laid there, and it just gave her a chance to soften, because I think it's when you feel like it's there but you're not accessing it. Well, it can be both, but I sometimes think being in that stillness, putting screens away, whatever you want, just let yourself be, can be really helpful. To not try to force, you just lie in that shape and breathe. I teach yogic breath, ujjayi breath, which is like long, smooth inhales and exhales through the nose. But I also encourage people, when they're feeling it, to sigh like out their mouth or make sound. Because that can sometimes elicit, and again, I'm not trying to force them to have a reaction, but it's just, you never know what you're holding. And for me, for a long time, when I would sigh, I never made sound. I really found that I would whisper, or I would be like, and still I struggle with that, but I realized there was a lot stuck here. And so whenever I would go to a class where there was like mantra or more sounds, I would lose it, or I would just not be able to participate. Because as soon as we started vocalizing, tears and tears and tears. And so it can, I think it's interesting to try an open pose like this if that's comfortable for you. You can lie flat if it's not, and just breathing. And as you're breathing, if you're feeling it at the time, to just kind of like scan your body, because we don't necessarily know. I feel like we can be surprised by where we're holding things. I didn't know this was a thing for me until I started trying to do a chant and was just like, oh God, I can't, it's all. So giving yourself that space to be curious about your body, to be curious about what's going on, to be compassionate, and allowing yourself to back away, right? It's also fine to like feel it and be like, that's a bit much. I'm good. I'm going to come out. It's not about like fall into that emotional hole. Good luck, right? I've definitely got kind of started going in and then been like, that's enough. I'm going to come back and have a bit
and
of
then we
tea.
need to protect ourselves more, right? So like there's that, like you said, like a wave almost, right? Like the wave of life, expansion, contraction. We need sometimes to feel like you also referenced the weighted blanket, and I think of that being very like almost entombing, or not entombing, that's the wrong word, but back to that experience of being in utero, almost that safety blanket.
I love a weighted blanket.
Yeah, but then with that, sometimes this can feel too exposed, and so I guess, and that's where what would be an example of a pose in your practice that you like for being more in a ball? Would that be like what's it called? Prayer? No. Child's pose.
Child's pose is pretty good, where you're on your front. It's different for my body because of my shape. I do wide-legged child, so that there's space for my chest and my belly, but you are sort of bowing down, and you can also stack your arms so that you're resting your head. And sometimes I do it with that bolster, like that big cushion underneath, and then I just like hug that bolster. So that can feel nice. You're kind of your chest is protected, but it's also like a restful pose. You're lengthening through your spine. I'm trying to think of another one. They're all, in a lot of ways, like yoga is such an expansive practice, but even just like little seated forward folds, coming over your legs, letting it be soft, like not trying to get a stretch necessarily, because you will anyway, just folding over yourself will do that, but just being soft, chin to chest, right? Things that sort of help you feel a little bit held. And then there are gestures of compassion. So sometimes it's simply when you're seated in meditation, hands over the heart, hand on belly, holding your own face, right? These are they can't, it depends how people are feeling with self-touch, but I'm really into that lately when I teach, like self-touch on the arms, the chest, the belly, because the belly is such an area for people. A thing. If it's not a flat washboard, we don't want to deal with it. And so like learning to make friends with those parts, and just self-touch to acknowledge that you're here, that you exist, that it's yours. And we're also, even though these are very gentle, they're also very empowering, because we're not waiting for somebody else to come along and do touch or whatever, or hug, or to help us feel like we're worth something. And again, I think that's a thing that's been peddled to women and femmes, that you need someone else to tell you have value. And so the more we get to do these like practices where you consistently are telling yourself, I'm here in this body and I have value. And that doesn't mean, like we were talking about earlier, it doesn't mean that we're suddenly like fake happy. I'm not talking about like, I'm positive, right? It's, you can still feel crappy. You don't have to love every piece of your body or love what it looks like. But I think that there's a difference between that and like just loving ourselves. And if you just think about when you love another person or people or pet, whatever it is in your life, they're not perfect. And you're not like, well, I will only love them when they're perfect. You just love them. You love them for who they are, flaws and all, but we don't give ourselves the same respect. We expect something else. And so these simple acts, right? You don't have to be doing yoga for this. You can sit in your chair, right? We start to be like, I'm here and I'm yeah, I like I say, I have value, and I love, so it still feels dorky for me to be like, I love myself, but it's important. It's important to say it. And I used to say it to myself in the mirror, which when I first started doing, I was like, please don't let any of my ancestors be looking at me here. They're going to be like, what has happened? But it was an important practice to like look in my own eyes daily for a while and be like, I love you. And especially when having a bad day, I love you. It's so important. Even if you laugh at yourself. 'Cause yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a beautiful kind of note to pause on. I think I want to keep talking. I've got like I'm enjoying this, and I also want to just respect the hour we've set aside, and check back in and see if anyone else has anything to say. So thank you, Helen. That was really, really amazing.
Oh, I love it. I love talking about this stuff. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I really felt the warmth of all your experience, and just, yeah, all the journeys you've been through and all the grief you've been through to become more more compassionate, essentially, like open with your practice and with people. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So Katie, how are we doing?
Good. Yeah, no questions right now. I have a few points that kind of stuck out to me, or we can just call it as well, whatever you guys are feeling time-wise and everything.
I kind of want to know, Katie, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm nosy. I want to
Yeah, I'm going to sound like I have a list here really quick, but it's the Gabor Mate video, just to bring it up because I thought it was so important, is The Wisdom of Trauma, that documentary. It's amazing. And when you're talking about in the body and like having emotions express and energy blocks move in the body, I found that in my past, for as long as I could remember, I always had like in my throat, when I wouldn't allow myself to cry, this hot burning, like I could feel the physical energy, the block there of myself, stopping myself from crying, because the narrative that we received often was like, just in general, and especially in like a European family, was like, don't show your emotions.
Yep.
And so I say this like it just to put it out there that it can take time for this energy to move, because it took me years of just allowing myself to cry whenever I needed to cry, to not actually feel that anymore. So it takes time, I think, to be like, it's important to be patient with the body and to not expect that just because, you know, you do a yoga pose, which when you did this, I went like this, and my whole self just relaxed. I was like, oh, like my whole body, it just like, I could just feel my nervous system was like, oh yeah, like it was so nice. But like, just to give yourself time, because it takes, like, stuff stuck in the body is it's on the physical form at that point, and the physical, it's become matter at that point, and it takes some time to shift matter because it's a denser energy. So,
and it's hard because that's not popular, right? People don't, we're sold like it has to be a fix like that. And
yeah,
the real annoying answer is that it's if you're trying to look at years of stuff, why would it be fixed? Yeah, with one yoga pose, or things will maybe start to shift, but it's definitely it takes time. You're absolutely right. It takes time. Yeah.
And showing up, like when you're triggered with it or something, meeting yourself there with as much softness as you can, and over and over and over and over and over again, until it becomes normal programming in your mind, and one day you're like, oh, I don't have that thing anymore. But it's such a patience game. Yeah, and I love when you said, you were talking about like you ran into the ocean in Tofino, and I was like, yeah, I wish I could have like been there to witness that. And I had a similar thing this year, and I'll make this really quick, but I just noticed when it was cold, or the water was cold out here, I'm by the ocean, and I wanted to refresh because it was so hot out. But my tendency was to like slowly wade in and like it would be like 20-minute process just to get in. And sometimes I wouldn't get in because I chicken out. And I just kind of got to this point where I was like, forget it. I'm going to become a person that just dives right into the water. And that was like a similar thing. It's like, you know, checking, like, what is my story around that? And just to like be more expansive and to trust that I can do that for myself is just all this stuff we keep in our bodies, right? And how it, I think, mirrors the way that we move through life as well. And
I was going to say that's what it did for me. I would just realize this cautionary energy was reflective of me in life, which sometimes is a good thing, but in a lot of cases it didn't feel quite right. Yeah, I used to say if there was like an easy point A to point B where I was trying to go, I would make the most difficult path, crawl like on my belly, like just so like squeak.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes that physical energy of like charging into the water, diving in or whatever it is can help you to like maybe, yeah, when Keith was talking about being stuck, it can help sort of unstick that energy elsewhere as well, because we don't always want to be so cautious. And so, like I say, 20 minutes, you're like, I don't even want to be in this water anymore. An hour just to get up to my ankle. Now I gotta go. So.
Yeah. And the story I'm telling myself as I do that, like, oh, I'm not safe. Like it's such, because safety, the body can give us so much safety and can make us feel also very unsafe depending on our relationship with it. So yeah. Little things like that, we think it's in the physical world because we live so much in our mind. We think I need to unravel this in my mind and figure it out. But sometimes like running into the ocean with your arms open, like yelling, is a great thing. It's very healing.
It makes me think of one of the gifts that Wim Hof is giving the world through his teaching of ice and really being okay with being really, really cold, and how resonant that is for so many people right now. Not only the breath, but the cold part, as a way of expanding in our zone of tolerance. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up, Katie. I actually have one more question for you, Helen, if you're willing.
Yeah, of course.
I feel like the time we're headed into right now in the fall, it's going to be very intense. It's also the metal element, the grief element. I feel like the next 6 months are going to be very intense, where there's, we're in this age of Aquarius. There's all this learning, mental stuff going on. People have a lot of judgment about what someone else is doing in their life. And what we're talking about is embodiment, which is the opposite, and heart-centered awareness. Sort of. So I guess, what would you share with people headed into this time about the importance of an embodied practice and the importance of grief? Because I feel like there's going to be a lot of shifts, like information shifts in the next little while, and it's pretty. Chaos brings a lot of need to let go. So how do you do that in your life on a regular, and how would you gift it to others?
I find, I don't always stick to it, but a little bit of structure is important for me. I used to really rail against structure. I think because I had come out of like the diet world for so long that I was like, no, nobody will tell me. But if I don't have it, then I'm a bit listless. So and what I mean by structure is just like, I try to think of a routine time to get up. I usually do some yoga practice, not every day, but I have some classes I go to in the week. And then some like morning practices, like super simple, and it's whatever it is for each individual person. So like a little bit of structure, and I think allowing yourself to, again, it's like we usually get like a blanket, this is what we should all be doing now, and I think asking yourself questions is really, really helpful. So asking yourself what feels good for you, or asking yourself if you are feeling that need. I feel like a lot of people coming out of this time and heading into the fall has like a New Year's kind of energy to it. So people feel very like they need to achieve. And so I think it's important to then ask yourself why. And if you want to relate it to like comedy and improv, and in improv, there's a thing where you go, well, if this is true, what else is true? So if you're creating a reality, if that's true, and it's the same for life, if this is true, what else is true? So asking yourself questions, asking yourself why, and it can be really interesting what answers arise. And I don't know if I'm fully making sense here, but like, even for me, for a long time, when it was about changing my body, when it was like, well, why? And then why that? And then why that? The answer really became like, I just wanted to feel like I could live my life. And so when I could go, oh, I can just do that. Great. I don't need this whole other bullshit, pardon my language, in the middle. I can just live my life. And so it can be really interesting if you're feeling a certain way going into the fall, like you have to do a certain thing or be something or achieve these things. People are so stressed about their bodies during COVID, like just weight gain is a huge stress, which I think is awful that became a thing. You can, if you start to like peel those little layers, like, okay, I want to do this. Why? And then maybe you'll see that either yes, you're on the path that is natural for you, or maybe you'll realize, oh, I just wanted to feel a certain way, or I wanted to be outside more, or whatever, and realize you can maybe circumvent the nonsense or the stress, and you can just do that and have that thing, and to let yourself. I really am gentle with myself, and that was not an easy thing for me, to be gentle. And so to be gentle and to allow and to be compassionate. And that doesn't mean you're inactive. That doesn't mean you don't have goals and dreams. It just means you go in the direction in a more pleasurable way. It just means you go forward without being a jerk to yourself and maybe people around you. So yeah, ask yourself questions, get to know yourself. You might be like, oh, I didn't know this. I'm pretty great. Or, oh, I've been doing this one thing or many things that don't serve me, and they were never about me, and it was somebody else's idea of what I'm supposed to be, and I realized I didn't want it. And it's a hard realization, but it's also very freeing, because you can go, bink, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to be true to who I am, and I think there's a lot of peace in that, but it's hard work, unfortunately.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a beautiful. The things I took away from that are having structure to the daily practice, and then also inviting in almost the opposite, like the questions or the spontaneity at the same time. Like, what do I feel in this moment? Does that, and going a little deeper with our motivations. So thank
and structure
you.
provides room for that, right? Like
Yeah.
that's what I've learned. Structure, or some kind of structure, provides you a container for yourself, so that you feel safe, so that you feel this, so that then you can be more spontaneous.
Yeah.
But you have your own back with this. And that's not easy. Some days I do it, some days I don't. And when I don't, I'm always just like, oh, I don't know. So it's helpful to have it. Yeah, for sure.
I agree.
Well, Katie, any last words? Helen, any last words? We are going to get going, because there's a beautiful day out there. And it's been really, I just want to thank everyone for being here and sharing the time with us. And for all the people who have watched this in the future, thank you for sharing the time with us. And I wish you all, as always, like lots of self-compassion and love, and a big group hug for the Light Action Gateway.
And hold your face.
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna hit the bye button. So thank you, Helen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Oh, before you go, people can find you at Helen Camisa. I had it in my mind to do that earlier. Helen Camisa, when we put it on YouTube, we'll put it at the bottom. HelenCamisa.com or .ca?
.com. That's my website.
And then that links to your YouTube, your comedy, and your yoga, right?
Yeah, you can find all of that. HelenCamisa.com.
And you're on Instagram, you're Helen Camisa Yoga?
You got it.
Okay, perfect.
And Good Not Great Yoga, Good Not Great Comedy on Instagram too. I'm not even on Instagram, but I saw that, right?
Yeah, Good Not Great Comedy and Hot Snack Comedy.
Ooh, nice.
Hot Snack. Yeah.
Okay,
Awesome.
thank you.
Okay, for real now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.